So in today's video, I'm going to be going through a Buddhist iceberg chart that I made. The way it's structured isn't meant to be sort of like as this is how you should progress through Buddhism. It's more of this is things I think everyone's familiar with, going closer and closer into more obscure things. It definitely isn't all-encompassing, and I'm not an expert by any means. So if you think there's anything I've missed or should have included, or anything I got wrong, feel free to leave a comment. And some things will be included twice. The reason why is just because beginners or people who are new to Buddhism will have a significantly different understanding as the actual meaning behind it. So that's why some things are included twice. Phase 1, we're going to go through very quickly, starting with karma. The first impression people have is karma is this almost cosmic justice, like you get what's coming to you, you get what you deserve. Since it's also included further down the iceberg, you'll know this isn't actually true. Second is mindfulness. Obviously, anyone who gets into Buddhism, the first thing they're interested in is mindfulness. Third, psychedelics. Pretty basic. There's a huge overlap between psychedelic culture and Buddhism. Not Buddhism the religion, but Buddhism as this sort of a bastardized philosophy that people think somehow intertwines with drug consumption, which obviously, and as you'll find out later in the iceberg, it doesn't. Next is meditation, and when I say meditation here, I'm talking very specifically about either counting your breath or focusing on your breath. Some people get really crazy and do body scan meditation, but obviously the average impression people have of Buddhist meditation is incredibly, incredibly narrow. Zen, most people who know about Buddhism will know about Zen Buddhism specifically. Maybe they'll know about Tibetan, but Zen Buddhism is like the go-to. And the reason why is because the Western impression of Zen Buddhism is that it's incredibly sterile and divorced from the religious background of Buddhism. Though if you look at Zen in Eastern countries, obviously it is incredibly religious, with Zen priests routinely being used to cast off ghosts and demons and stuff like that. So obviously Zen is a religion. However, the impression most Westerners have is that it's just like a philosophy, It's just like these beliefs and stuff. But it's not like a religion or anything. And then the final entry on phase 1 is Tantra. Obviously, almost everyone knows about tantric sex. There's the Kama Sutra, which I should have actually googled, but I'm pretty sure that's a Hindu set of scriptures. But there is a tantric practice in Buddhism, though it's a lot harder to learn about just because some people regard all of Tibetan practice as tantric. Or Vajrayana, sorry, not Tibetan. Though Tibetan is a form of. Anyway, the point is, Tantra is actually kind of hard to learn about in Buddhism, but the impression is it's just about having really cool sex and making your penis feel really good, which obviously is not Tantra. Anyone who has any familiarity with any form of Tantra knows that that's not the case. So now, like I said, we're going as quick as we can, just because your time is valuable, and I hate myself whenever I ramble. Layer 2 starts with Theravada and Mahayana. These are the two major schools of Buddhism. There is also a Vajrayana. I found some people claiming Vajrayana is just a form of Mahayana. However, it seems to be distinct enough both in its actual physical location and its culture and also its practices that it should be considered a third branch, at least in my view. But again, I'm no expert on Buddhism. The main differences between Theravada and Mahayana is Theravada is more, to oversimplify, hey, here's what the Buddha said, that we're going to just focus on that. And Mahayana is more, here's what the Buddha said, so we can extrapolate from that. Mahayana would be, at least to a Westerner, if you grew up Christian, I grew up incredibly Christian, going to church and all that. Mahayana will seem much more religious, though both are religious because Buddhism is a religion. But Mahayana's much more focused on like deities and gods with a lowercase g rather than an uppercase G, and things of that nature. Next is the Four Noble Truths, which I've never been good at getting in order. We'll try. The first is the existence of suffering. So, if you wish to exist, you will suffer. You might have heard this as life is suffering. That's a poor translation, which is something that plagues Buddhism. These incredibly bad or narrow translations that don't really capture the full context. It's more if you wish to exist, your existence will contain suffering, and um, then it extends out to if you don't exist, you won't suffer. You know, you can't miss out on something you can't have. Like, you could never be sad about not being born because you weren't born. As in it, so from the Buddhist perspective, it's preferable to not exist because if you don't exist, you will not suffer. If you do exist, you will suffer. But you could have a very good life. Your life could have more pleasure than suffering. But even if it does, you can't be sad about not having that life because, well, you were never alive to be sad about it. The second is the origin of suffering. I believe the origin two. I think the main one is desire, as in the reason you suffer is because you have a desire or preference. However, it does also make distinctions between wholesome and unwholesome desires. So, for example, desiring to help your community be happy and healthy is not seen as like the same as desiring to rob someone so you can buy a new flat screen TV. These are two very different forms of desire with different origins. The third is the cessation of suffering, which is basically you can alleviate suffering in this lifetime. This has been evidenced all around you. You know, you see people with all kinds of horrible lives, and they are perfectly happy and content. And there seems to be people who are like borderline immune to suffering. So obviously, it is possible to end suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the path of ceasing suffering, which is the Eightfold Noble Path, which is a perfect segue into the Eightfold Noble Path, which is right view, right speech, right thought, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Obviously, these are big, and you should definitely read an entire book on the Eightfold Path if you want to understand it fully. The ones that I think are worth focusing on are one is right mindfulness, because right mindfulness means your default state, so kind of instinctively. So it's not just about being mindful, but it's about being mindful of the right things. You can be incredibly mindful of the fact that you're ugly and people look at you weird. That's probably not helpful, but you can also be mindful of the fact that people judging you doesn't ultimately matter because it's all impermanent anyway. Right concentration is another one. It's all about concentrating on the right things. It's not just about, oh, I can focus for 19 hours on, the latest Brazzers video. It's about, I can concentrate on the right things. And that brings us next to the 5 precepts. These are essentially 5 foundational things you should not do as a Buddhist under any circumstance. However, there's some exceptions. So, like, killing in the form of self-defense is still negative karma, but it's not seen as bad as killing for the fun of it. So, intention matters, but certain actions are just, you don't do this. Number 1 is not killing, or not intentional taking of life. A lot of Buddhists believe this includes things like paying for animal products. The Buddha did make an exemption for monks to eat meat, but he also specified it should be meat that wasn't bought for the sake of them. So it seems like even under Buddhism, the less animal products you eat, the better. And second is no stealing. This is often said as no taking what was not given, which is why a lot of Buddhists believe piracy is even included in this. Even though you are not taking something physical, you are taking something which was not given. Certain forms of manipulation could count as stealing as well. For example, if I trick someone into giving me information about someone else, because we'll get to that later. But the third is no sexual misconduct. This is wide ranging, but I think it's similar to what's that legal statute where it's like, is this content porn or not? You don't need like a rigorous legal definition, you just know it when you see it. I think sexual misconduct's the same. If you're unsure about if what you're doing is sexual misconduct, it probably is. There's a really good book called Cyber Loka, Loka, and it's written by I believe a Buddhist monk if I remember correctly. I read it a few years ago, and it explicitly talks about how pornography is definitely a violation of the sexual misconduct precept, which is interesting because obviously the world has changed a lot since Buddha's time, so it's good that there's people sort of focusing on that. The fourth precept is no no false, harsh, or idle speech. Um, Obviously, again, self-explanatory. It's not that difficult. It's not that deep. Um, Idle speech, I've heard, can be a bit more complex because, like, if I say, "Hey, how's the weather?" is that idle speech? But it depends on if it serves a purpose. Small talk does have a very important evolutionary and emotional purpose. It's not like worthless. So, you know, and then precept 5, which makes the psychedelics from the earlier layer even more ironic, is no consumption of intoxicants. The logic behind it is intoxicants will just, like, they don't have any value to begin with. They always carry risk. And then also, like, you know, they decrease mindfulness. Now, a lot of people will point to a certain verse where I believe it was an old woman came to the Buddha and said that a doctor has prescribed changa. People will say it's cannabis. It's not actually certain whether changa was cannabis, and if it was cannabis, it's not sure whether it was high THC or high CBD. And even if it was high THC, back then that meant something very different than today. However, the Buddha said it was fine because it was prescribed by a medical professional. So, you know, kind of not giving an okay to weed there. More of, hey, this old woman was smoking weed before bed to help deal with pain, and the weed was prescribed by a doctor. You know, so and the fifth is metta. I feel like this is uh, a highly recommended form of meditation for beginners, and if you go the actual Buddhist path, so you're going to temples and monasteries and stuff, this is a form that will be commonly recommended. If you use Headspace, it'll more say focus on your breath. But metta meditation is basically just compassion meditation. It works. Jeez, why would I not research? Because I'm doing an iceberg video. You start off by extending compassion to yourself, then you extend it to someone you like, then you extend it to someone you dislike, then you extend it to someone you hate, then you extend it to everyone, regardless, and that's like the basic practice. It's also worth noting as well, metta meditation seems to be uniquely good compared to other forms of meditation at dealing with loneliness and social isolation. So just if you ended up on this video because you think Buddhism would be useful for your mental health, it is worth noting metta meditation actually does work uniquely well when it comes to social isolation and loneliness. Layer 3, starting off strong with sutras. Sutras are basically just Buddhist texts. I feel as if this is something people don't give a lot of credence to, especially at the start, and then as time goes on, you have to focus more on it. If you're focusing on Zen Buddhism, you've got the 3 Zen Sutras, which are the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and the Platform Sutra. Though the Heart Sutra is actually seen a lot throughout all of Buddhism, mainly because it's a very short sutra, so that's the first sutra most people will choose to memorize, because memorizing and being able to recite sutras is actually quite a large part of Buddhism, especially as a lay practitioner. If you're a Mahayana, Zen being a form of Mahayana. If you're a Pure Land Buddhist, you have the 3 Pure Land Sutras, which I believe are literally just called the short Pure Land Sutra, the medium Pure Land Sutra, and then the long Pure Land Sutra. Which again, all in all, I think it took me 3 to 4 hours to read them all. So short read again. And if you're a Theravada Buddhist, you've just got all of the Pali Canon, so enjoy that because that's just basically all of it. The Theravada tradition doesn't seem to have preferences when it comes to sutras, or at least not consistently. So, it's a lot harder to find out what sutras are specific to Theravada or highly preferred among Theravada. Next is karma, and this is more the more correct understanding of it, which is just, it's not this person sat up in heaven making sure bad people get punished and good people don't. It's more of this indifferent transferent force, more like gravity. If I drop an apple and it happens, or if I drop a knife and it happens that the knife falls and hits my foot, it's not because I'm a dumb person who deserves to be punished. It's because I happened to drop the knife when my foot was located under it. Karma is very indifferent, and not only that, but because rebirth or reincarnation, rebirth being the more accurate descriptor, is such a large part of Buddhism, a lot of times karma won't even affect you until several lives down the line. So you could be a horrible person in this lifetime, and that karma will never catch up with you in this lifetime. Next is Pure Land. Pure Land is a huge part of Buddhism, mostly just because it's the easiest practiced and it's very forgiving, let's say. I've heard a lot of people say that dual practicing Pure Land and Zen is ideal because Zen is very much focused on enlightenment and alleviating suffering in this lifetime, whereas Pure Land is focused on the next lifetime or the moment of death in which the mind stream leaves the body. Um, and because of that, that when their lives are busy or they've got a lot going on, they'll focus more on a Pure Land practice, and when they've got more time, they'll focus more on a Zen practice. Pure Land Buddhism is the most accessible. You basically recite to Amitabha Buddha, which, depending on which form of Pure Land you practice, Japanese is Namo Amida Buddha, and you just recite that. That would be your form of meditation. And then when you die, you try and picture the Pure Lands, which you can learn about in the three Pure Land Sutras. But because it's seen as so easy and so accessible, it got incredibly popular incredibly quickly, and it is still incredibly popular, especially among lay practitioners who don't have the time to dedicate towards enlightenment in this lifetime. Right? If you're working like an 8 hour backbreaking job, you can't meditate for 2 hours every day. It's just not viable or sustainable for most people. Next is the Fat Buddha. Everyone's familiar with this. This is not the historical Buddha, which would be Siddhartha. This is Budai, Budai, um, and it's a Chinese monk that was alive during the Tang Dynasty. Um, some people believe he's the incarnation of I forget what he's called. Maitreya. Maitreya. There was a future incarnation of the Buddha who's said to come back to Earth to bring about a new era of enlightenment. Some people believe he's like a manifestation of him, but it's not actually known too much about him. He seems to just have just been a monk during the Tang Dynasty, but again, not the historical Buddha. Next is the Bardo Tholdo. Now, this is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Most people are only familiar with the Bardo part of it because the Tibetan Book of the Dead is actually a very long book. It's meant to be read to people as they're dying to help them navigate the next stages that the mind stream goes through after death. But most people are only familiar with a very short part of that, and yeah, it's literally just meant to be like read to people who are dying. But it's one of like the immediate things because there was what was it there was a book written by Timothy Leary that took the concept of trip sitting and psychedelics and applied it onto the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which massively widespread its popularity. But it's a very small, very minor part of Tibetan Buddhism, which Tibetan Buddhism being a small sect of Buddhism. Next, we have hippie Buddhism. This is just a I didn't quite know what to call it, but it's essentially the fact that early in hippie culture, sort of the 60s counterculture movement, a lot of hippies went to India and they were big on like religion is bad, uh, sexual liberation is good, and drugs are also really cool and epic. And the Buddhism they brought back has still to this day influenced popular culture when it comes to Buddhism, because Buddhism is actually quite conservative when it comes to drug consumption and when it comes to sexual promiscuity. But because these hippies were essentially the arbiters of information and they had their own beliefs and their own biases, they could selectively choose what was brought back about Buddhism, and this led to, again, cultural images or visions of Buddhism that are just not in alignment with reality. I'm not saying these hippies were like evil people purposefully trying to fuck things up. It's much more likely they just believed they knew better than Buddhists, or they believed that some of the Buddha's teachings apply and some of them didn't. Or it could have just been a legitimate cultural or language barrier. Or it could have been that the people teaching them about Buddhism were just responding to their questions, and if they weren't bothering to ask about drugs and stuff because they already believed drugs were fine, it makes sense that they might not necessarily know that. But obviously, one of the five precepts, which are like the five foundational do not do these things, one of them explicitly says no drugs. And then the other says no sexual misconduct, and stuff like lust is seen as sexual misconduct, which sexual promiscuity is obviously downstream from lust. So you can't have sexual promiscuity without also having lust, and lust is forbidden as well. So, well, not forbidden, but it's seen as like don't do it. Next is prostration. The reason I put this here is just because it's a sign of respect in Buddhism. And usually, when you're at this level of the iceberg, you've probably seen Buddhism in its original cultures or its original context. You might have even visited a temple or a monastery, depending on where you live and how accessible they are. So I just thought this was a nice place to put it. Layer 4, the first one, lay people don't meditate. Now, this isn't, they never meditate, but meditation is definitely overemphasized compared to Buddhist communities outside of the West. Uh, there's several reasons why. Firstly, meditation is an oftentimes intensive practice that carries quite significant risk. It was argued against for lay people for several reasons. Firstly, it makes you much more open-minded, which is actually a risk. I mean, I'm not I don't live in like a nice place. If I go outside, I'll see all kinds of bad stuff. I'll see people doing drugs. I've seen two people get stabbed in the last 2 years, which actually isn't that many to be fair, but it's still a lot. I see violence on a regular basis just because of where I live geographically. Uh, and you're surrounded by people who are bad influences. So the idea is if you start your day off with a bunch of meditation, you're now going around a bunch of people who are negative influences, whilst also being more open minded, which, if you're more open minded, you are just essentially easier to control. So it's generally recommended against, though most Buddhists will still meditate uh, on special occasions. It is a very minor part, and also, as you'll see in the lower rungs, meditation when Buddhists do it is very different from sitting there with your eyes closed, focusing on your breath for 20 minutes every morning. Next is Terma. Terma texts are just basically Tibetan texts that are hidden and found later, and the idea is Terma treasures, I believe they're usually called rather than Terma texts. But the entire point is they are hidden away, and then they will be found at a later date when people are ready for the teachings. Uh, Next, recitation. This is a major part of most Buddhists, especially lay practitioners' practice. The idea is you should be able to memorize certain things like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path, and instead of sitting there with your eyes closed, just thinking about your breath, your time would be better spent reciting Buddhist texts, Buddhist sutras especially, because then you're not only focusing your mind on one singular thing repeatedly, but you're also re-exposing yourself to the Dharma, and it's seen that hearing the Dharma or speaking the Dharma is always beneficial. Like it always results in good karma, and it always changes your mind for the better. Um, Next is mudras, though I've heard this called mudras. These are just basically hand postures used in Buddhism, Hinduism, most Eastern religions. Andrew Tate's got some as well. And the basic idea is it just changes how energy channels through your body. That's basically it. Next, hell realms. There is heaven and hell in Buddhism. However, distinct from other religions, it doesn't last forever. It lasts for a certain amount of time. The hell realms most people will be familiar with is the Blue Lotus realm, in which it's so cold that you form these blue blisters all over your body. They're incredibly painful. And then eventually the blisters burst, and when they burst, they look like blue lotuses stemming from your skin. And then the realm of hungry ghosts is another one where you have an incredibly unsat a uh, absolutely strong. Why am I struggling to speak? You have an incredibly intense desire or thirst for water, and you've got an incredibly small throat. So no matter how much you drink, you're never satisfied, and then you gradually become emaciated and dehydrated and yada yada. Though some people dispute whether it's a hell realm or whether it's something distinct entirely, or whether it's meant as an allegory. But that's it. Next, taking refuge. This just means to take refuge in the Buddha, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. There's a posture I've seen associated with it, but you basically go to a Buddhist monastery or temple, and you will formally take the refuge. This will be similar in the triple jewel, triple gem, as well. It's also called. This is much. This is similar to Christianity's baptisms, except typically you should take refuge when you're an adult, and the reason why is because you're actively saying I believe in something. You can't really do that as a child. But most people will take refuge, and you ideally should. There are some people who accept that refuge can be taken in private, so this is something you could do yourself, but there's people who dispute that. Again, I'm not an expert on Buddhism, so don't just take my word for it, and I'm not going to have any strong opinions on that. Layer 5, starting with a Tibetan Buddhist practice called Chod, and this practice actually got women much more widespread recognition because it was developed and spread by a female nun. Uh, if I remember correctly, you're basically taking suffering and then offering that suffering up to demons. I can't remember the practice exactly. There has been a book written about it that was specifically made so that Westerners who aren't Buddhists can perform the practice, called Feeding Your Demons. It's a fairly esoteric practice in Tibetan Buddhism, and not a lot of people practice it much. That's about all I know. And then the next is meditation does not equal meditation. This isn't to say anything grandiose, it's just to say most people misunderstand what meditation is, because in Christianity, meditation is just singular minded focus, usually on the same thing. But in Buddhism, it's much more vast. There's a really good book called Meditation in the Pali Canon by, I want to say like L.S. Cousins or something. I was almost going to say C.S. Lewis, but that's a different guy. The translation that gives is that meditation, the root word of it, a more accurate translation rather than meditation would be bringing into being. So once you understand meditation as you are trying to bring something into being, kind of like you're trying to make it so that your thoughts and your actions are an example of the Buddhist path. So meditation isn't just focusing on your breath; it's also being a good person. If I if I'm walking past a homeless person and I look at him and think, oh, he's disgusting, he's filthy, and then I think, oh well, I mean, anyone can end up like that. Plus, he's a person, he suffers. I should really think of him as more than that. That would be a form of meditation, or that's sort of the way I understood it at least. Next is heaven realms. These are, uh, I feel like a bit more obscure than hell realms, just because it's harder to wrap your head around. Um, the common heaven realm, sorry, I've heard discussed is the Diva realm. This is basically a place of infinite pleasure with infinitely beautiful beings, and it sounds great, but it won't last forever, and eventually you'll get sick of it. People say, "Oh, I'd never get sick of that," and it's like, okay, what about when you turn on like cheat codes on a video game? The video game gets boring very quickly. Now imagine if that was happening for thousands of years. Not only would you get bored of it, but eventually it'd start to actively harm you. Uh, yeah, a lot of people use heaven and hell realms as allegorical teachings, and the point of the diva realm would be like too much pleasure is actually a bad thing, basically. Next is kidnapped llama. This is just a reference to the fact that the Chinese government almost definitely kidnapped and possibly executed a someone who the Dalai Lama named as the person who would be able to find his next incarnation. Is because China's had a long-standing history of trying to influence and effectively take over Tibet, and because Tibetan Buddhism has a large amount of political influence in Tibet, this was just their way of undermining it. Next is Upaya. I probably did not pronounce that right. Definitely not, I would say, actually. But Upaya is basically skillful means. It means being able to explain something in a way that other people can understand. Is more seen in Mahayana, but um, what was the sermon? I think it was called the flower sermon, where the Buddha looked at a crowd, and he was giving a speech, and then instead of giving a speech, he just someone asked him, "How do I reach enlightenment?" or something, and he picked up a flower, and then one person in the crowd instantly reached enlightenment. These types of stories are incredibly common in Zen as well, with the idea of instant enlightenment. But the point is that there is not like here is a combination of words that will make everyone reach enlightenment or make everyone understand. It's more you need to be able to empathize highly with who you're talking to and understand their mind in order to actually portray things in ways that they can not only understand, but in ways that excite them so that they practice. Next is Buddha heads. This is just a reference to the fact that Buddha, if you look in the West, Buddha head statues are literally just the head cut off at the neck. And the reason why is because when Westerners first went over to go, they wanted to steal statues after they'd finished destroying places. And statue is quite big, so they just cut off the heads and took them, which is why a lot of Buddhists find the just a Buddha head offensive. And then Buddhists on Reddit who think Buddhism is a philosophy will say, oh, well, Buddhism is actually about non attachment, so you shouldn't worry about stuff like that. Even though there's a long history of Buddhist monks being incredibly aggressive when it comes to you cannot slander the Dharma, you cannot be disrespectful, is why so many countries will literally not let you have visible tattoos of the Buddha. It's why if you're getting any tattoos related to Buddhism, you have to be very careful about where you place them, like not on the hand you wipe your ass. But then some people on Reddit who spend all their days taking drugs and talking about how Buddhism is just a philosophy will say, "Oh, actually, it doesn't matter. So don't worry about a Buddha head," you know. Um, and then next, one we referenced earlier is Tantra. The best description I've heard of Tantra when it comes to the practices relating to pleasure, which is what most people are interested, such as the sexual practices and things like that, is you're trying to experience such a high level of pleasure that it actually makes the pleasure itself become inaccessible or pointless. Um, if you had the most mind blowing sex of your life, then eating that extra cheeseburger or having sex with a random girl at a club probably wouldn't feel as enticing. And there is actually a practice where women who were incredibly versed in tantric sex would actually go out and just pick men up at bars and then have sex with them. And then those men would ultimately see all pleasure as like hollow and pointless, almost giving them essentially instant enlightenment. One thing I want to note is Tantra and Tantric practices can only be taught in person. They cannot be learned from books, they can't be learned from YouTube videos. So if anyone tells you they have to be practiced through a direct lineage of tantric practitioners. So if someone tries picking you up at a bar and they've got like a Buddha tattoo and they say, "Hey babe, I know all about the tantric sex," the first question out your mouth should be, "Where did you learn it from?" And if they say anyone, and if they say a name of a tantric practitioner, you should be able to find out what lineage they belong to. Because otherwise, this person does not know tantra and thinks they do, or they know they don't know tantra and they're just trying to manipulate you into banging them. Okay, we're now on the sixth and final level. Incredible stuff. Wow, what a great video. What a really cool person who made this video. First is dream yoga. This is basically lucid dreaming with the intent practice not of banging hot girls, because any guy who's ever told you they can lucid dream or tried to learn lucid dreaming, every single one without exception tried to learn it so that they could bang hot women in their dreams. But the practice in Buddhism is to essentially use that time to gain greater insight into your consciousness, into your instincts and your impulses. But then also, it's just seen as like practically speaking, you dream for 8 hours a night, and time dilation can make that feel like much longer. So you just have more time to practice Buddhism. You can meditate or put yourself in challenging situations such as making it so that you repeatedly die in your dream to try and lower your level of attachment to your body, stuff like that. Next is neo meditation. This is a practice by Shosun, who was a monk, kind of. He was also a samurai, but whether he was a monk is questionable because even though he was technically a monk, he also kind of wasn't a monk. He left the shogunate, and when he did, he specified his desire to become a Buddhist monk, which could have led to him being executed or having to commit what's it called? Harikara? That's not it. The where you kill yourself as a Japanese samurai. But he was willing to risk his life to become a Buddhist monk, and a huge part of his whole deal was trying to make it so that Buddhism was accessible outside of monasteries. But Neo meditation is where you picture the protectors of the Dharma, Neo, and I think the other one's also called Neo but spelled differently. And you just picture them in your mind, and it's said to give you energy, or you literally copy the physical stances, and the idea is that you are embodying them in some way. Um, it's kind of a niche practice, but it's interesting nonetheless. Next is death energy. This again comes from Shosun, and it's the idea that if you become mindful of death, you essentially have like a near limitless level of energy. And there's two ways you can think about this. Is one, if I tell you to run until you collapse from exhaustion, and you can run 1 kilometer, and then suddenly I point a gun to your head, you can probably run further than 1 kilometer. So like clearly we're never actually fully using up our energy. We always have reserves. And another more common example would be like when people find out they have cancer, suddenly they have the energy to do whatever they've been wanting to do for a long time. They just finally get around to it. Or if you're aware that, like, hey, I'm running out of time, that awareness of death, it just leads to seemingly more energy than if you don't have that. And death energy is just kind of a form of meditation to really channel that and to keep you to make you consciously aware of death in all of your moments. Next is a Subha meditation. This is, I think at least, especially among uh, us whiteys, this is a very niche practice when it definitely shouldn't be. It's useful for all kinds of things. Um, Luckily, I live fairly near to a cemetery, which makes this form of meditation much easier. Because you can just kind of sit in a cemetery and really set the tone, you know. And the goal is you basically visualize either yourself or other people dead in front of you, and then you visualize them in with your eyes shut, I should say, and then you visualize them going through each state of decay, and eventually you become not necessarily desensitized, but you just kind of realize that that's all we're ending up as, and this is actually a common practice to get rid of lust, because when you look at a woman, if you see that she is literally filled with shit and piss, she suddenly becomes less appealing. Now that's not to say you should tell her you're disgusting, you've got poop in there. It's more to say you should keep in mind that your mind is selectively only when you have lustful feelings. Those are stemming from you only seeing the positive things or the sexual features of a woman, and a suba meditation is to try and balance that out because you can still feel attraction to someone even once you know they've got poop inside of them. But you're probably not going to feel intense lust when you have that same level of awareness. So it's just a way of dampening lust, but it's not to make you repulsed by women or anything like that, or repulsed by people. Um, and that brings us to the last one, which is again a Tibetan practice, just because Tibetan practices are kind of they get a bit crazy. Foa is just basically a way to transfer your consciousness at the moment of death to try and get a more favorable rebirth. So the idea is that when your mind stream leaves your body after death and you're going through the process of rebirth, maybe you can kind of like steer it a little bit to get you more what you want. And that brings us to the end of the iceberg. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If not, leave a comment because it all of it promotes my video. Okay. So if you think there is anything I should have included or